An oil exploration team is flying over one of the most desolate stretches of the Sahara Desert in 1958 when they spot something impossible. Sitting in the sand, hundreds of miles from anywhere, is an American bomber from World War II. It looks almost perfect, like it landed yesterday instead of 15 years ago. The paint is barely faded. The machine guns are still in their turrets. When they land to investigate, they find even stranger things. The radio works. Coffee is still in thermoses. A logbook tells the story of a crew that disappeared without a trace in 1943. This is the Lady Be Good, and her story is one of the most haunting mysteries of World War II. 9 young Americans flew into the Libyan desert and vanished. What they found 15 years later would answer some questions, but raise even more disturbing ones. This is the story of how one navigation error turned into a tragedy that took over a decade to fully understand, and what the discovery revealed about survival, death, and the unforgiving nature of the Sahara. Let's start with who these men were and what they were supposed to be doing that night in April 1943. The Lady Be Good was a B-24 Liberator bomber, serial number 41 to 24301. She was assigned to the 514th Bombardment Squadron, 376th Bombardment Group, stationed at Salak Airfield in Libya. The crew was relatively new, having arrived in North Africa just days before their fatal mission. This would be their first combat operation. The pilot was Lieutenant William Hatton, 24 years old. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant Robert Toner. The rest of the crew included the navigator, bombardier, radio operator, engineer, and 3 gunners. 9 men total. All of them are young. All of them were about to fly into a mystery that wouldn't be solved for 15 years. The mission on April 4, 1943, was supposed to be straightforward. A large formation of B-24s would bomb Naples Harbor in Italy, then return to Libya. It was a long mission, about 1,400 miles round trip, but not unusual for the Mediterranean theater. The Lady Be Good took off in the afternoon, along with 24 other bombers from her group. But problems started immediately. A sandstorm had blown through the area, and visibility was poor. The formation struggled to assemble properly. Several bombers turned back with mechanical problems. Lady Be Good continued with the formation toward the target. As the bombers approached Naples, weather conditions deteriorated. Heavy clouds covered the target area. Most of the formation bombed through the clouds without being able to see what they were hitting. Some bombers aborted and brought their bombs home. Lady Be Good dropped her bombs, but whether she actually hit anything is unknown. The weather was so bad that proper bombing was nearly impossible. After dropping their payload, the bombers turned for home, flying individually or in small groups rather than in formation. This is when Lady Be Good's troubles really began. The flight back to Libya should have taken about 3 hours. The bombers would fly south across the Mediterranean, make landfall on the Libyan coast, then fly inland a short distance to Salak Airfield. Navigation was done by dead reckoning, using airspeed, heading, and time to calculate position, and celestial navigation when stars were visible. Radio direction finding could help, with ground stations providing bearings to help aircraft find their way home. But all of this required clear thinking, accurate calculations, and functioning equipment. On the night of April 4th, things went wrong in ways the crew of Lady Be Good didn't recognize until it was too late. At some point during the return flight, Lady Be Good became separated from other aircraft. The crew was flying alone over the Mediterranean in darkness. They radioed their base asking for a radio bearing to help them navigate. The base provided a bearing, but there may have been errors or misunderstandings in the transmission. The crew believed they were still over the Mediterranean, approaching the coast. In reality, they'd already crossed the coast and were flying south over the Sahara Desert. This is the critical navigation error that doomed them. They thought they were over water when they were over land. They were looking for the coast ahead when it was actually behind them. Here's what probably happened based on the reconstruction of the flight. Lady Be Good crossed the Libyan coast, but the crew didn't realize it. The coastline was dark, There were no navigation lights because of wartime blackout, and the desert at night looks remarkably similar to the ocean. Both are vast, dark, and featureless. The crew kept flying south, thinking they were still over the Mediterranean heading toward the coast. They kept expecting to see land ahead, but all they saw was darkness. As time went on, and they still hadn't reached land, they became increasingly concerned. They were using fuel. Eventually, they'd have to make a decision. The crew radioed that they were lost and low on fuel. They asked for emergency bearings and assistance. The ground stations tried to help, but communications were difficult and the crew's position was unclear. At some point around midnight, about 8 hours after taking off, Lady Be Good's fuel ran out. The crew faced an impossible situation. They believed they were over the Mediterranean, which meant bailing out would mean landing in water at night. But they had no choice. The engines were dying. Lieutenant Hatton ordered the crew to bail out. All 9 men jumped from the aircraft, their parachutes opening in the darkness as they descended toward what they thought was the Mediterranean Sea. But they weren't descending toward water. They were descending toward the Sahara Desert. Imagine the confusion and terror as these men, expecting to splash down in the sea, instead hit dunes. Some were injured in the landing. All were shocked to find themselves in a desert instead of an ocean. Meanwhile, Lady Be Good, with no one aboard, continued flying on autopilot. Without a pilot to control her descent when the fuel ran out, the bomber flew on until her engines finally quit completely. Then, in what may be one of the most remarkable coincidences in aviation history, she somehow managed to belly land intact in the desert, settling into the sand with minimal damage. She would sit there undiscovered for the next 15 years. The crew, scattered across miles of desert by their parachute jumps, had to find each other in the darkness. Over the next several hours, they gathered together. 8 of the 9 men made it to a rendezvous point. One, the bombardier Lieutenant John Waravka, was separated and would never find the others. The 8 men who gathered together faced a desperate situation. They were in the middle of the Sahara Desert with no supplies except what they carried. Their emergency survival kits contained some food, water, and basic supplies, but nowhere near enough for what they were about to face. The men made a crucial decision based on faulty assumptions. They knew they were somewhere in Libya, though they didn't know where. They decided to walk north toward the coast, believing it couldn't be more than a few dozen miles away. In reality, they were over 100 miles south of the coast. They'd flown far deeper into the Sahara than they realized. The walk they expected to take a day or two would actually require walking through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth for distances they couldn't possibly survive. For the next several days, the 8 men walked north through the desert. The Sahara is almost incomprehensibly harsh. Daytime temperatures exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun is merciless. There's no shade, no water, no landmarks to navigate by. The sand is difficult to walk through, sinking under your feet with every step. At night, temperatures drop dramatically and the desert becomes bitterly cold. The men were wearing flight suits designed for high-altitude cold, not desert heat. They had minimal water, which ran out quickly in the extreme heat. We know some of what happened because several of the men kept diaries. These diary entries, found with their bodies years later, provide a heartbreaking chronicle of their final days. The first day, they walked through scorching heat, rationing their water carefully. They were hopeful. They believed the coast was close. Surely they'd reach help soon. The second day, their water ran out. The heat was unbearable. Some men were already showing signs of dehydration and heat exhaustion. They kept walking because stopping meant dying. There was no shelter, no shade, nowhere to rest safely. By the third day, the reality of their situation was becoming clear. They weren't going to reach the coast as quickly as they'd hoped. Some of the men were in bad shape. Their lips were cracked and bleeding. Their skin was burned and blistered. Dehydration was affecting their thinking and physical capability. But they kept walking because there was nothing else they could do. Giving up meant dying in the desert. At least walking gave them a chance, however slim. The entries in the diary of co-pilot Robert Toner document the deterioration. On day 4, he writes that they're still walking, but several men are in poor condition. His handwriting is becoming shaky. On day 5, the entries are brief and harder to read. He notes that they covered a good distance, but there's still no sign of the coast or any help. On day 6, he writes Sunday, still struggling. On day 7, he writes Monday, no help yet. That's his last entry. Shortly after, Robert Toner died in the desert along with most of the other men. What killed them was primarily dehydration and heat exposure. The human body can survive weeks without food, but only days without water, less in extreme heat. The Sahara sun was pulling moisture from their bodies faster than they could replace it. As dehydration progressed, their blood thickened, their organs started failing, and their brains swelled. Death from dehydration is an ugly, painful process. These men suffered tremendously before they died. Some probably experienced hallucinations, a common symptom of severe dehydration. They might have seen mirages of water that weren't there, adding psychological torment to their physical agony. 5 of the men died together at a location later designated as Last Camp. Their bodies were found grouped, suggesting they'd stopped to rest and never got up again. They'd walked about 75 miles from where they'd bailed out, an incredible distance under the circumstances. But it wasn't enough. They were still miles from the coast and any possible help. 2 other men, the Engineer Staff Sergeant Harold Ripslinger and Radio Operator Staff Sergeant Robert Lamott, tried to continue even after their companions died. They walked another 20 miles before they too collapsed and died. Their bodies were found separately, each having walked as far as they physically could before death took them. The bombardier, Lieutenant Waravka, who'd been separated from the others during the bailout, was never found despite extensive searches. He either died alone somewhere in the desert or possibly walked in a different direction. His fate remains unknown. The 8 men whose bodies were eventually recovered all died within about 2 weeks of bailing out. They walked between 75 and 95 miles through the Sahara before succumbing to dehydration and heat exposure. It was an agonizing death for all of them and a testament to human endurance that they walked as far as they did. Meanwhile, back at Salak Airfield, Lady Be Good and her crew were listed as missing. Search aircraft flew over the Mediterranean looking for wreckage or survivors. Ground forces in Libya were alerted to watch for any sign of the crew. But the search focused on areas where the aircraft was expected to be, along the coast and over the Mediterranean. No one thought to search deep in the Sahara because there was no reason to believe a bomber returning from Naples would have flown that far inland. After several weeks with no sign of the aircraft or crew, they were declared missing and presumed dead. The families were notified. The war went on. For 15 years, Lady Be Good sat in the desert undiscovered. The Sahara preserved her remarkably well. The dry air prevented corrosion. There was no rain to rust metal or degrade materials. The bomber sat there like a time capsule, waiting to be found. The bodies of the crew lay scattered across miles of desert, their remains slowly being covered by shifting sand. The mystery of what happened to them remained unsolved because no one knew where to look. Then, in May 1958, an oil exploration team from British Petroleum was flying over the Libyan desert searching for oil deposits. They were using a small aircraft to survey a particularly desolate area about 400 miles south of the coast, far from any human habitation. One of the team members spotted something that shouldn't be there. Down in the sand was what appeared to be an aircraft. They flew lower to investigate. It was definitely a plane, and it looked American. They could see U.S. military markings. But what was an American plane doing this far into the desert? The oil team reported their discovery. The U.S. Air Force, which had taken over from the Army Air Forces after the war, sent an investigation team. When they reached the crash site, what they found was astonishing. The Lady Be Good was sitting in the sand, looking almost airworthy. The landing gear was up, suggesting she'd belly landed. The fuselage was intact. The wings were undamaged. She looked like she could nearly fly again. This was a bomber that had disappeared 15 years ago, and she looked like she'd crashed yesterday. When investigators entered the aircraft, the preservation was even more remarkable. The radio equipment still worked. There were thermoses with coffee inside, though the coffee had long since evaporated. Cigarettes and personal items were scattered around. Most importantly, they found the aircraft log and other documents that identified the plane as Lady Be Good and provided information about her last mission. The serial number matched AB 24 that had been reported missing on April 4, 1943. After 15 years, the aircraft had been found. But where was the crew? The condition of the aircraft provided important clues. The lack of damage suggested she'd landed under some control, probably on autopilot after the crew bailed out. The fuel tanks were empty. There was no sign of the crew aboard, confirming they'd abandoned the aircraft. But why had she flown so far south? Investigators realized that a navigation error must have led the crew to believe they were over the Mediterranean. In fact, they were deep over the Sahara. The crew had bailed out, thinking they'd land in water, but instead landed in the desert. If the crew had bailed out somewhere near where the aircraft eventually crashed, their bodies should be in the area. The Air Force organized search parties to look for remains. They searched by air and on the ground, covering hundreds of square miles of desert. In February 1960, almost 2 years after the aircraft was found, searchers discovered a survival kit and parachutes about 15 miles northwest of the crash site. This suggested the crew had come down in this area. Further searching found more equipment and supplies. Then they found the bodies. The discovery of the remains, accompanied by personal effects and diary entries, allowed investigators to reconstruct what had happened to the crew. The diary entries were particularly valuable, providing a first-hand account of their desperate walk through the desert. The entries stopped on day 7 or 8 for most of the men, around the time they died. The physical evidence showed they'd walked extraordinary distances before dying. Some had discarded equipment to lighten their load. All showed signs of extreme dehydration and heat exposure. 5 bodies were found at the location designated last camp. 2 more were found miles beyond that point. The bombardier was never found despite extensive searches. His body is still out there somewhere, probably buried under sand. The remains were returned to the United States and buried with military honors. Families who'd spent 15 years wondering what happened to their loved ones finally got answers, though the answers were heartbreaking. Their sons and husbands and brothers had survived the bailout, but died slowly and painfully in the desert, walking toward help that was farther away than they knew. The Lady Be Good discovery and the recovery of the crew raised questions about what could have been done differently. Could the crew have survived? The answer is probably not under the circumstances, but some factors worsened their chances. First, the fundamental navigation error that led them to fly south instead of circling near the coast was catastrophic. If they'd realized they were lost earlier and taken steps to reorient themselves, they might have avoided flying so deep into the desert. Better navigation procedures or equipment might have prevented this error. Second, once the crew bailed out and realized they were in the desert, their decision to walk north was reasonable, but it was based on incorrect assumptions about their distance from the coast. If they'd known they were 100 miles from help instead of 20 or 30, they might have made different decisions. Staying with the aircraft, if they could have found it, might have been smarter than walking. The plane was a visible target for searchers and provided some shelter. But finding the aircraft after parachuting out in darkness would have been nearly impossible. Third, the survival equipment they carried was inadequate for a desert situation. They had limited water, no means to collect more, and insufficient protection from the sun. Desert survival requires large amounts of water and protection from heat. The crew had neither. Even if they'd known proper desert survival techniques, they didn't have the resources to implement them effectively. They were doomed by the combination of being in the wrong place with the wrong equipment and insufficient knowledge of just how far they had to walk. The story of Lady Be Good resonated deeply when it became public in the early 1960s. Here were 9 young Americans who'd flown off to war and disappeared. their fate unknown for 15 years. The discovery of their remains and the diary entries showing their desperate final days touched people's hearts. It highlighted the human cost of war in a very personal way. These weren't abstract casualty statistics. These were real men with names and faces who'd suffered and died far from home. Their families' long uncertainty and eventual painful closure made the story even more poignant. The aircraft itself became famous. Lady Be Good was partially salvaged, with some components removed and parts of the airframe preserved. The fact that she'd survived 15 years in the desert in such good condition fascinated aviation experts and the public. She became a symbol of the many aircraft and crews that went missing during World War II, mysteries that would never be fully solved. The Lady Be Good's mystery was solved, but how many others remained lost forever in oceans, jungles, mountains, and deserts around the world? There have been controversies and conspiracy theories about Lady Be Good over the years. Some people questioned whether the official account was accurate. Some suggested the crew might have been on a secret mission or that there was more to the story than was publicly disclosed. But investigations and analyses of the evidence have consistently supported the straightforward explanation. This was a navigation error compounded by bad luck. The crew got lost, flew the wrong direction, bailed out in the desert, and died trying to walk to safety. It's tragic, but not mysterious in the sense of involving secrets or cover-ups. The psychological aspect of the crew's final days is haunting to consider. They knew they were in serious trouble, but they had no way to tell if rescue was coming or how far they had to walk. The diary entries show hope gradually turning to desperation as days passed without finding help. Some of the men probably died still believing rescue might be close. Others might have realized before they died that they weren't going to make it. The mental anguish of dying slowly from dehydration while walking through endless desert must have been almost as bad as the physical suffering. The story also raises questions about fate and chance. If the weather had been better over Naples, the formation might have stayed together, and Lady Be Good wouldn't have gotten separated. If the crew had realized their navigation errors sooner, they could have corrected course. If they'd bailed out 100 miles farther north, they might have landed near the coast and been rescued. If the oil exploration team had been flying a slightly different route in 1958, they might not have spotted the aircraft. Small differences in any of these factors would have changed the outcome completely. The crew's fate came down to a series of small errors and unlucky breaks that added up to tragedy. From a technical perspective, the Lady Be Good incident led to improvements in navigation procedures and survival equipment for aircrew. The military recognized that better navigation aids could prevent crews from becoming hopelessly lost. Better survival equipment and training could improve chances of survival if the crew ended up in hostile environments like deserts. These lessons were bought with the lives of Lady Be Good's crew, but they potentially saved other crews in later conflicts. The environmental preservation aspect is remarkable. The Sahara Desert is one of the few places on Earth where an aircraft could sit exposed for 15 years and remain in relatively good condition. In most other environments, weather, vegetation, and scavengers would have quickly destroyed or scattered the wreckage. The desert's dryness and sterility created a preservation environment similar to cold storage. This allowed investigators to find the aircraft in good enough condition to learn from it and to mount searches for the crew. In a jungle or over the ocean, Lady Be Good would never have been found. Today, parts of the Lady Be Good are in museums, and the story is taught in Air Force survival schools as a cautionary tale. The crew members are honored as casualties of war who died in service to their country. Their story has been told in books and documentaries. The name Lady Be Good is remembered not for any particular military significance, but for the haunting nature of the story and what it reveals about the thin line between survival and death in wartime aviation. The families of the crew members finally got closure when the remains were recovered and identified. However, the closure came with the painful confirmation that their loved ones had died alone in terrible circumstances. Some family members visited the crash site later, making pilgrimages to the desert where their relatives had died. These visits provided some sense of connection and completion for people who'd spent years wondering what had happened. The military's efforts to recover and identify the remains were appreciated by families who might otherwise never have known what became of their loved ones. If this story of 9 young Americans who flew into mystery and tragedy moved you, if it gave you appreciation for the countless untold stories from World War II, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We're bringing you the forgotten stories, the mysteries solved decades later, the human dramas behind the statistics of war. Thanks for watching, and remember, behind every casualty number is a story of real people who deserve to come home.